I find it interesting to look at how we're reacting to this total eclipse. It's a thing that is so well known throughout our country, and everybody is super engaged in it, right? We all know it's happening, we know when it's happening, we know the path of it. We're going out of our way to experience it, to look at it, to learn from it. And yet there are eclipses that happen every day that we don't look at. In fact, sometimes we do our best to avoid even noticing. And so when we're talking about total eclipses today, those are the eclipses we're going to talk about. We've been alluding to them all morning, and our dear friend Marianne Williamson has a wonderful way of describing these eclipses, so I'm going to let her words from A Return to Love start us out today. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, and your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people will not feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. So the eclipses that we're looking at today are those personal total eclipses. When the light that we are, when that true nature of wisdom and love and peace that expresses as us is eclipsed by our doubts, by our fears, our worries, our judgments. And the truth is, when we look at this idea of the personal eclipse, we see that unless we have reached that exalted enlightened state, interesting term, enlightenment, in reference to an eclipse, we are all living in a partial eclipse most of the time. Whatever it is that our doubts or fears are, our own light is shadowed most of the time. Depending on how much work and effort we have put into developing our consciousness, our standard eclipse may be a little more or a little less, but we're all coming from a place where our light is not shining as clearly as it could. And so we're going to look at that today because I have an interesting perspective in the work that I do in the world. As I mentioned earlier, I serve on the board here at Unity Village Chapel. I also work with Unity World Headquarters. I'm on the editorial advisory board for Centers for Spiritual Living, and I travel talking to other communities. So I get to look out into the world, into the New Thought movement, and see what is happening, see what the energy and the direction of the movement is going. I look in my own life, see what I'm being called to. And when I look in all of these places, what it seems to me is that we are being called forward into Unity's fifth basic principle, which is this: knowing these ideas is not enough. We must practice them. We must live them. We must demonstrate them out in the world. And so I believe that we are being called in this point in time to do this personal growth work, to look at applying these principles so that we can recognize when our partial eclipse is becoming total, and then applying spiritual tools so that we can prevent that eclipse from happening, dial it back to where we normally rest, and then going a step further and actually coming to a new state of being less eclipsed by doing the forgiveness work, the contemplation, the prayer, the meditation, all of these things that help us to release our judgments and our fears and our doubts so that we can have more light in the world. We need a little more light in the world, have you noticed? So the first thing to do is to become clear about what it feels like when we're coming into a total eclipse. How do we recognize that our light is being eclipsed? And the good news is there's a very simple test that we can do. It's a very brief sentence that is this: I am upset because blank. If you can complete that sentence, your eclipse has begun. It may start with a little irritation. I'm a little irritated. I'm a little irritated because whatever that is where you are blocking your own light. I'm a little annoyed. Might expand then to I'm a little agitated or irritated or I'm angry. And then we get to the point where we have that total eclipse of our own light. I had one about a week ago, I'll admit it. And it's an interesting experience because when we come out of that eclipse, when we get back to ourselves, we often look and go, I don't know who that was or where I went, but I hope that guy never comes back. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Anybody had that experience, right? So we know how to recognize when we're going into an eclipse. And we all know what that feels like, that feeling of starting with a little irritation, then a little more agitation and growing, and what it feels like to be less and less ourselves. I was a wonderful little blame anger monster for about 20 minutes that night that I totally eclipsed my own light. It wasn't fun at all. But I wasn't clear enough to go back into my spiritual practice. I hadn't yet thought about this talk and about how I would, if I had that experience again, recognize the eclipse coming and do the spiritual growth work to dial it back. So, we know how to recognize the eclipse. But what do we do when we see it coming so that we can dial that back and let more of our light shine? Now, I want to give a little forewarning here. We're going to be talking a lot about spiritual principle today and how we utilize spiritual principle to grow our consciousness. And there's a very interesting thing with spiritual principle. When we're looking at a spiritual principle in relation to what our experience is in the physical world, they can often seem incredibly far apart. And it can feel like this spiritual principle is a very high and mighty ideal that there's no possible way I can ever attain when I'm in the face of this experience over here. And it can become, if we use it as a way to judge where we are and belittle ourselves, it can become detrimental rather than beneficial. So instead, when we're looking at spiritual principle, we want to use it as a guide star, as the destination that we're headed to, so that we can then evaluate how far off course am I based on this high ideal of where I'm going, and then how can I adjust to bring myself back in line with that. Now, the other challenge with spiritual principle is that it will require us to really look deeply at what our beliefs are, to really look deeply at how we show up in the world. One of my beloved spiritual teachers asked the question frequently, are you willing to systematically dismantle your structure of knowing? We have the structure of knowing that we come from every day. And if we take that structure of knowing and put it up against a spiritual principle, we'll often find that we have to dismantle what we thought we knew so that we can rebuild it in alignment with principle and then live our lives from that place. So the spiritual principle that's going to help us get out of that eclipse is unity basic principle number 1. We say it every day here that we have a service. There is only one presence and one power, active as the universe and as my life, God, the good omnipotence. So that's where we're going today. So, we've recognized that we're moving into an eclipse. What can we do with that? Don Miguel Ruiz in the 4 Agreements provides us with a really wonderful tool. One of those 4 agreements is to take nothing personal. Take nothing personal. In my total eclipse that I had a few days ago, I was making the experience very personal. For those of you who know me, you know that I've been working very diligently for many, many years to put out my first book, and it's coming right up to the wire. I was working with a vendor who was helping to do some of the design work. And this had been a process that was months longer than either of us expected it to be, a lot more frustrating than either of us expected it to be. And here I was being sent the final version of the document, that if I had any changes beyond this, it was going to cost me more money. And I opened it up, and on the table of contents, 3 page numbers are wrong. Right up front, glaring obvious error. Now, that was not personal. That wasn't this person sitting there thinking, how can I really upset Ben today? What can I do? And then we take a lot of time to sit and think about how I can best irritate Ben. That's not what was happening. Not what was happening at all. But from the place of my eclipse, I couldn't see it. In fact, I could see it, but it didn't do me any good. I could try to logic out why I shouldn't be upset, why I shouldn't be taking it personally, but I was doing it from the level of the eclipse. Einstein reminds us a problem cannot be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So if we are in an eclipse state and we're trying to get out of it by using logic from an eclipse state, we're not going to get anywhere. We got to fall back into principle. So, one presence and one power, active as the universe and as my life. Let's hold that up against the idea of something is being done personally to me and see how that works out. So in order for somebody to do something personal to me, a couple of things have to be in place. One, there has to be some other outside force, and that outside force has to be intending me harm. But if we look at, there is only one presence and one power, active as the universe and as my life. That means there really, in spiritual principle, is no other. There is no one outside of myself who can intend to do me harm. If God is all there is, and I am that, then you are that, then you are that, then Mary is that, then Carl is that, then everybody is that. And so there is no source that can do anything to me. That's a high and mighty ideal. It can maybe take us back from our upset and allow us to say, wait a second, this isn't personal. This is only God doing what God does. There's nothing to be done to me. And that can help us. That can help us to step back a little bit from making something personal and help us to dial back to our standard level of eclipse. But we can take it a step further. We can look deeper at that principle and say, wait a second, the second part of that principle says God the good omnipotence. And so what that means is that anything happening to me in the arena of my experience, happening to me, is intended for good. Because if God is all there is, and God is omnipotent good, all-powerful good, and God is the only thing in existence or happening anywhere, then regardless of what I think about my experience, and regardless of how my experience feels, there is an intention for good for me in that experience. Now, depending on where you are in your life and what that experience is, the possibilities of good could be varied. But regardless of where we are, there is always one thing guaranteed in any experience that we can use to benefit ourselves. I am upset because whatever we fill in the blank with is the neon sign pointing us to what our spiritual growth is, to where our work is. If God is good, then whatever is going on in my experience is meant to help me dial back my standard level of partial eclipse so that I can shine more light in the world. And so when I see that, when I use this principle in an experience of finding something personal, not only can I step back and say, this is God, this is not somebody outside of me doing something to me that's meant to harm me, but in fact, as God is good and God is all there is, this too is good, and it's meant for me to learn and grow, for me to find out where that button is that's being pushed inside of me. That interesting idea of, getting your buttons pushed. The truth about that is we installed our own buttons. And when we look at the idea of God, again, see, this is a deep exploration of principle. When we look at God, we also say that God is unconditional love. So, if we put the idea of unconditional love up against our buttons being pushed for no other purpose than to push our buttons, we see that that doesn't work. You cannot have an unconditional loving presence pushing your buttons for the fun of pushing your buttons. That just doesn't work. The only way that Spirit would push your button is if your button is ready to be uninstalled. The only reason it would be pushed is because God is saying to you, now is the time for you to do the work to get rid of this false belief, get rid of this judgment, get rid of whatever it is, so that you can shine your light. That's what a loving universe is. That's what a loving Spirit does. Now, not taking things personal can sometimes be a tall order. If we're going through the grocery store pushing our cart and somebody isn't paying attention and accidentally bumps our heel with their cart, there might be that initial clenching of anger, of taking it personal, but it's really easy in that experience to step back and say, well, that's just an accident, it wasn't personal. Sometimes it's harder. In light of Charlottesville, it's harder to not take something personal. But there's more that we can do with this principle when just recognizing that nothing is personal is not enough. And that is to recognize this. And this truth might be a bit of a challenge for you. And so I encourage you to listen with an open mind and to explore deeply within, because we'll get there, believe me. Everybody, at every single time in their life, is doing the absolute best they believe they can at the time. Regardless of what is going on, they're doing the best they can. Let me be clear. I'm not saying this to justify any ideology. I'm not saying this to gloss over any action of hate or violence. It's not about that. Those ideas and those actions, when we look at spiritual principle, are absolutely not aligned with spiritual principle. But the truth is, if we are looking at those ideologies, at those actions, and we are allowing ourselves to fall into that self-same energy, we are doing nothing but perpetuating them. And so when we look at the fact that everybody is doing the very best they can at the time, it can help us to move rather from judgment into compassion. Again, not to justify anything, but for our own consciousness, so that we can be at peace, so that we can shine our light more than we have before, so that we can dial back our own eclipse. So let's look at how this works from a little bit more of a personal perspective. Imagine you have a choice in front of you, and you have two options. Option one, you know, is going to help a lot of people. It's going to make you feel loved and joyful. Everybody who is at the decision of this, at the choosing point of this, at the outcome of this choice, is going to be benefited. You're excited about making that choice. You really want to do it. Everybody is encouraging you to make this choice, and you know that not only is this choice going to benefit and bless everybody, but that you can not only achieve that choice, but excel down that road. Option two. You know, it's not the best option. People are going to get hurt if I make that choice. In fact, it's not really aligned with who I am, and if I go that route, it's going to really not be great for my life or for the lives of other people around me. Nobody's encouraging me to make this choice. How many of you would choose option two? Nobody? You mean nobody chooses the worse of two options when they are clear what the good option is? You don't, nobody else does? Let's take this a little bit more into experience. Everybody had a personal solar eclipse at one point, like we were talking about earlier? Okay, you know what that feels like after having gone through it? Imagine living in that feeling every second of every day of your life. From that perspective, would you show up at a hate rally? If the answer is no, then your worst experience doesn't compare. It might be a little cliche to talk about walking another mile in somebody else's shoes, but this is how we do it, friends. And so what can we do with this? When we look at the idea that everybody is doing the best that they can, we can then divorce the person from the ideology. Not to justify the ideology, not to gloss it over, but to go back into principle. There is only one presence and one power active as the universe and as my life, as all life, God the good, omnipotence. So whoever it is that we are looking at, whatever circumstance or situation we might be involved in, that individual person is not their action, is not their ideology, is not their thoughts and beliefs. If that were the case, then every single fear that you had would be who you are. And you don't feel that way, do you? You don't look at being afraid of the dark when you were a kid and say, I am fear of the dark, that's who I am. We don't confuse ourselves with our thoughts or our feelings or our actions. We recognize the divinity in who we are. People who may ascribe to an ideology that we don't agree with are still emanations of spirit. They're still divine light and divine love expressing. They're no more holy than you. They're no more holy than me. They're no less holy than Jesus. They're no less holy than any person ever to express on the planet. That self-same divinity is present in all of us. So when I use this idea to separate the person from the action, we can go back to where we started about taking it personal. If I confuse you with your ideas, with your actions, and I refuse to see the light in you, then I am not taking it personal, but I am making it personal. I'm making it personal to you. And if I say this ideology, this action, this belief is abhorrent, and then I confuse that with you, I have now said that you are abhorrent. And if there is only one presence and one power, and that power is God expressing as every person, then I have now said that God is abhorrent. And if God is the only thing expressing anywhere, I have said that myself is abhorrent, and that everybody that I know and love is abhorrent. Because if there was only one presence and one power active as the universe and as my life, then what I do to anybody, I do to everybody. And so when we come into this place of compassion, when we say who you are is not what you do, and we find compassion within ourselves, it opens us up to share more of our light. We all know the difference. It doesn't take much to recognize that if we have an idea in our minds that a specific person is bad and wrong and there's no place for them, they're vile, and we walk up to that person and we say hello, we know that our words don't carry hello. They carry how we feel about that person, what our perspective of that person is. At the same time, if we walk up to somebody to say hello with the idea of, I completely disagree with your ideology. I think your ideology is completely unaligned with spiritual truth, but I recognize the light in you. I see you as spirit, and I love you as spirit. It's a very basic practice of unconditional loving. To divorce a person from their actions and to say simply, you exist. I exist. We're all here in existence together, and if God is all there is, then by God, it's God expressing as all of us. So what do we do with this? What do we do with these ideas? What do we do in the physical world to help alleviate these expressions that we see as not aligned? Well, one of the first things we can do is, once again, go back to principle. It seems like at this time there's a whole lot more activity around these ideas and these ideologies, that it's increasing in the world. It's not increasing, friends. It's been in our consciousness all the time. It's just that the button is being pushed. Why does God push a button? Because we're ready to uninstall that button. We are ready in consciousness at this point in time to uninstall these ideas, to remove them from our societal consciousness, and to move forward in more light and more loving than we ever have before. All of the work that we have done collectively as light workers meaning anybody who knows that there is only one presence and one power and that they are that, all of the work that we have done has brought us to the point to where these ideas can come to the surface so that we can take action against them, not against them, but to clear them, so that we can share more of our own light. So we start from there. We find ourselves in compassion. And then we discern for ourselves what is ours to do. I can't tell you what is yours to do in the physical world in relation to what we've been seeing. I can't even tell you what mine is to do yet. I'm still discerning that. I'm still looking within to find how I want to physically show up in the presence of these ideas to help alleviate them. But I can tell you for sure what the spiritual work is, what the inner work is. And that is to find all the ways that we are eclipsing our own light, to look at where we are judging other people, to find where we're taking it personal, and remind ourselves that there is only one presence and one power, and that power is good, that power is God. And so nothing is personal to me, but everything is meant to benefit me by the fact that it points me to my spiritual growth work that I can do to shine more light, because, friends, light is the only thing that's going to do it. If we come at this ideology from a place that mimics the ideology by saying you are bad and wrong and you have no place, that's the same energy. And we're just going to shove it right back down until another time when it can rise back up. But if we come at it from compassion, if we come at it from light, from loving, then we can make a difference. Then our actions can have impact. Right now, there are people in this movement who are having those conversations. I know personally of a very delightful minister who is setting up meetings with hate groups in the area, just so that she can sit with them and be a loving presence and start a dialogue. There is a documentary online right now about an African-American person in the South who took it upon himself to befriend KKK members simply because he thought to himself, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And without any intention to change them, he now has a collection of hoods and robes and flags that were given to him when those individuals that he befriended gave up their ideology. It's happening now, friends. We are in the process of lovingly clearing this ideology from our consciousness. And so I want to go back here at the very end to Marianne Williamson, because this is a very powerful quote. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, or fabulous? Who am I to be compassionate and loving? Who am I to be the place where love expresses in the face of hate? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, and your playing small does not serve the world. You are the light worker. You are the one who has heard these ideas and who, to whatever degree you are in your life currently, is embodying these ideas and working on these ideas that God is all there is. Who are you not to be the one to show up in that loving presence? Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people will not feel insecure around you. We are meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. As we work with our own spiritual practice to uneclipse our light, those around us see more light. And that light draws them to uneclipse themselves more and more. It happens automatically, friends. This is what it means to be active in our spiritual practice, Unity's basic principle number 5. As we live these principles and our light shines more into the world, others automatically let their light shine as well. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. My friends, it is an honor and a privilege to share with you. What I know for sure from looking at the brilliant, beautiful light that you all are is that Spirit sings your praises. The entire universe conspires for your highest good, and God is so thrilled to call you the beloved. Namaste.